The voting began in silence, and Ambassador Yun Sioha stood at the center of the council chamber while hundreds of beings decided the fate of her species. Each delegation's decision appeared on the central display as they cast their judgment. And Yun watched the numbers climb on both sides of the ledger. Reject humanity. 47. Accept humanity. 23. Her heart sank as the rejections continued to outpace the acceptances. And she thought about the 8 billion people on Earth who were waiting for news that might never be good. The Varthan delegation voted to reject, and the ambassador who had accused her of being dangerous watched her with cold satisfaction in his reptilian eyes. Reject. 89. Accept. 41. Yun kept her expression neutral, but inside she was calculating the odds, and they were not in humanity's favor. Then the Decivane delegation's vote appeared, and Elder Counselor Mira the Sivane had voted to accept. The chamber stirred with surprise, and several delegations that had been leaning toward rejection seemed to hesitate. The Decivane have always been cautious, someone whispered. If they accept the humans, perhaps we have misjudged. More acceptances began appearing, and the gap between the two numbers started to narrow. Reject. 112. Accept. 98. Yun watched the display with hope she did not dare to feel, and she wondered if her words had made any difference at all. The final delegations cast their votes, and the numbers stopped climbing. Reject. 156. Accept. 144. Yun felt the hope drain from her body like water from a broken vessel, and she closed her eyes for a moment before forcing them open again. The vote is concluded, Elder Counselor Threnix announced, and her voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. The council has voted to reject humanity's application for membership. The Varthan ambassador rose with triumph on his face. The motion now moves to the question of containment, he declared. I propose immediate quarantine of the human system until a permanent solution can be. The vote is not concluded, a voice interrupted. Every being in the chamber turned to look at Elder Counselor Threnix, who had risen from her throne and was descending the steps toward the central platform. What are you doing? Counselor Von Kethery, demanded. Threnix reached the floor of the chamber and walked toward Yun with slow, deliberate steps. The founding charter grants the Elder Council the authority to override a general vote in cases of exceptional circumstance, she said. And I am invoking that authority now. The chamber exploded with protests, and dozens of delegates were on their feet, shouting objections. Threnix raised her staff and struck it against the floor, and the sound that resulted was not the gentle chime of ceremonial protocol, but a thunderous boom that silenced every voice. I have lived for 600 years, Threnix said, and her voice carried to every corner of the chamber. I have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and I have seen species destroy themselves with fear and hatred. And I have watched the council make decisions that we later regretted. She turned to face the assembled delegations. Today, we were presented with a species whose true name frightened us, she continued. And our first instinct was to quarantine them, to contain them, to eliminate the threat before it could grow. She gestured toward Yun, but this human stood before us and explained what her species truly is. And I listened, and I heard something that I have not heard in 600 years of council sessions. The chamber was silent. Waiting, I heard truth, Threnix said, unvarnished and unapologetic. And the ambassador did not beg for acceptance. And she did not promise that humans would change. And she simply told us who her people are and what they want. She looked at Yun with something that might have been admiration. She told us that humans expect catastrophe. And she told us that they survive it anyway. And she told us that they plant seeds in ashes and watch them grow. Threnix turned back to the council. Every species in this chamber has forgotten what it means to struggle, she said. We have grown soft in our peace and comfortable in our prosperity. And when we encountered a species that remembers what survival costs, We wanted to destroy them because they reminded us of our own fragility. She raised her staff high. I say that is not wisdom, she declared. I say that is cowardice. And I will not permit this. Council to condemn a species simply because their existence makes us uncomfortable. The Varthan ambassador stood again. You cannot override the will of the council, he protested. The charter requires the agreement of all 7 elder counselors for an override. Threenix smiled. And it was not a pleasant expression. Then let us see where my colleagues stand, she said. She looked up at the 6 remaining elder counselors in their thrones. Counselor Vorn Kethery, she called. How do you vote? Vorn was silent for a long moment, and Yun watched his 4 eyes blink rapidly as he considered his answer. I have walked in the Forbidden's archive, he said finally, and I have seen what this council has done to species we feared. And I do not wish to add another dark crystal to that collection. He stood. I vote to accept humanity, he declared. The chamber stirred. And Threenix called the next name Counselor Myra the Sylvain. The ancient being rose with grace. My people named our world paradise, she said. And we have lived in that paradise for millennia. And we have forgotten that paradise can be lost. She looked at Yun. Humans have never forgotten that, she continued. And perhaps the galaxy needs a species that remembers what it costs to build something beautiful from ashes. She nodded. I vote to accept. One by one. Threenix called the remaining elder counselors, and one by one, they voted to accept humanity into the galactic community. When the final vote was cast, Threenix turned to face the chamber. The elder council has voted unanimously to override the General Assembly, she announced. Humanity is accepted as a member of the Galactic Council. The chamber erupted again, but this time the noise was mixed. And Yun heard both protests and cheers. Threenix approached her and placed one long-fingered hand on her shoulder. You spoke well, Ambassador, the elder counselor said quietly. But you should know that many species will still fear you, and the road ahead will not be easy. You nodded. Humans are used to hard roads, she replied. Threenix smiled. Yes, she said. I believe you are. The elder counselor turned to face the display one final time. There is one more matter, she announced. The official classification of humanity in the council records. She entered commands into the console, and a new entry appeared on the display. Species, human world, Earth true name, that which remains. When all else has fallen, classification. The cursor blinked. Waiting for input, Threenix looked at Yun. Every species has a classification, she explained. A single word that defines how the galaxy sees them. And the Varthans are gardeners, and the Sylvain are keepers, and the Drethkai are swimmers. She paused. What would you like humanity to be called? Yun thought about her grandmother and the garden and the seeds that were buried and rose again. And she thought about Earth and its storms and its earthquakes and its ice ages. And she thought about the billions of humans who had lived and died and given everything so that their children could have a chance to do the same. We are survivors, she said simply. Threenix nodded and entered the word, and it appeared on the display for every being in the chamber to see. Classification, survivors. The ceremony was concluded, and humanity had been accepted. And Yun Seoha walked out of the council chamber as the official representative of a species that the galaxy had learned to respect. She sent a message home that night, and she included the full translation of Earth's true name. And she told her people that they had been accepted, not despite what they were, but because of it. Back on Earth, a child read the news over breakfast and asked her mother what it all meant. And the mother looked out the window at the fields she had been tending and thought about the seeds she had planted last week and the flowers that would grow next month. It means the galaxy finally understands, the mother said. What we have always known. The child asked what that was. And the mother knelt down and scooped up a handful of dirt from the pot on the windowsill. "That the ground is not where things end," she said, and she let the soil fall through her fingers. "It is where they begin, and somewhere far away in the halls of the Galactic Council, beings who had lived for centuries spoke in hushed voices about the species that had named their world after burial grounds and rising. And they wondered what humanity would become, and deeper still. In the Forbidden Archive, beneath the chamber, Counselor Vaughn Cathari stood before the sealed registry and added a note to the human file. Classification: survivors. It read, "Approach with respect, and remember that this species does not stay buried." He turned off the display and walked back toward the light. And he carried with him the certain knowledge that the galaxy would never be quite the same again. The council chamber held its breath as Ambassador Yun Seoa stood alone at its center, surrounded by hundreds of beings who looked at her as if she were a bomb about to explode. Elder Counselor Threnix raised her hand for silence, though the chamber was already quiet enough to hear heartbeats. "Before you speak, Ambassador," Threnix said, "you should know what has been discussed in your absence." She gestured to the holographic display that dominated the center of the chamber, and text began scrolling across it in dozens of languages. "The Edamon has provided the full translation of your world's designation," Threnix continued, "and it has been shared with all present. Yun read the translation as it appeared in English primary surface meaning: ground, soil, dirt. Deep translation: that which remains when all else has fallen. Extended analysis: the final ground, the place where things are buried and from which things rise again." Yun stared at the words, and for a moment she did not understand why they had caused such fear. "This is what frightened you?" she asked, and genuine confusion colored her voice. A being from the Varthan delegation stood abruptly, his scaled skin flushing with agitation. "You named your world after death," he accused, "after graves and burial and endings, and you ask why we are afraid." "You named your world after the expectation of catastrophe," another delegate added, this one from a species Yun did not recognize. "Your entire psychology is built around the assumption that everything will be destroyed." Yun held up her hands. "May I respond?" she asked. Looking to Threnix, the elder counselor nodded. Yun took a deep breath and looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as she could. "You are not wrong," she began, and she heard gasps from several delegations. "Humans do expect catastrophe, and we have built our civilization around that expectation." The Varthan ambassador made a sound of triumph. "She admits it," he declared. "They are exactly what the Edamon revealed. A species that expects destruction and has prepared for it." "I am not finished," Yun said firmly, and something in her voice made the chamber go quiet again. She walked slowly around the central platform, and she thought about her grandmother and her grandmother's garden and the seeds that were buried every year and rose every spring. "You asked why we named our world after dirt," she said, "and the answer is simple: because dirt is what we trust." She stopped and faced the council directly. "Humans evolved on a world that tried to kill us every day of our existence. And I know you have reviewed the data, and you have seen the ice ages, and the volcanoes, and the earthquakes, and the plagues." She spread her arms wide. "Every other species in this chamber named their worlds after beautiful things. And the Varthans called their home the Eternal Garden. And the Sivane named theirs Paradise Sustained. And the Drethkai chose warm embrace of light." She lowered her arms. "And all of those names speak of species who expect the universe to be kind to them, who believe that their existence is a gift that will continue without struggle." The chamber was utterly silent now. "Humans could not believe that," Yun continued, "because our world never let us. And our sky sent storms that destroyed everything we built, and our oceans drowned our cities, and our ground shook and swallowed our dead." She paused and let the weight of her words settle. but the dirt, she said softly. The dirt always remained, and when the storms passed, we could plant seeds in the dirt. And when the floods receded, we could grow food in the dirt. And when the ground stopped shaking, we could bury our dead in the dirt and watch flowers grow from their graves. She turned in a slow circle, addressing every part of the chamber. We named our world Earth because Earth is the only thing that never abandoned us. And yes, that name carries the meaning of burial, but it also carries the meaning of rising. The Varathan ambassador stood again. Pretty words, he said dismissively, but they do not change what the Edamon revealed. And your species has built its identity around the expectation of destruction. And that makes you dangerous to every other being in this galaxy, does it? Yun asked, and she turned to face him directly. Or does it make us the only species who truly understands what survival means? She took a step toward the Varathan delegation. Your people named your world the Eternal Garden, she said. And that tells me you have never faced a threat you could not overcome. And you have never lost everything and had to rebuild from nothing. The Varathan's scales shifted color, but he did not respond. What happens to the Varathans when the garden burns? Yun asked, what happens when the eternal becomes temporary and the paradise becomes a wasteland? She looked around the chamber again. Every species in this room has experienced peace and prosperity for so long that you have forgotten what it means to struggle. And you look at humans and you see a species that expects destruction. And you are terrified because you do not know what we will do when it comes. She straightened her spine and lifted her chin. I will tell you what we will do, she said. We will survive, and we will rebuild, and we will plant seeds in the ashes and watch them grow. Because that is what humans have always done. Elder Counselor Mira the Sylvain rose from her seat, and her voice was soft but carried clearly. And if the destruction you expect comes from us? She asked. If this council decides that humanity is too dangerous to remain free? Yun met the ancient being's eyes. Then you will learn what every ice age and every volcano and every plague has learned, she replied. That humans do not stay buried, and the ground that swallows us will give us back. And we will rise. The chamber erupted in noise, and dozens of delegates were shouting at once. And some were calling for immediate action, while others demanded more time to consider. Threnix raised her staff and struck it against the floor 3 times. And the sound cut through the chaos like a blade. Enough, she commanded. And her voice carried the authority of 6 centuries. The ambassador has invoked her right, and she has spoken. And now we must decide. She looked down at Yun with an expression that was impossible to read. But before we vote, Threnix continued. I would ask the ambassador one more question. You nodded. You have told us what humans will do if threatened, Threnix said. But you have not told us what humans want. And a species that expects destruction must want something badly enough to keep fighting for it. Yun thought about her grandmother's garden and the seeds that were buried every spring and the flowers that grew every summer. We want what we have always wanted, she said. A place to plant things and a place to bury our dead. And a place to watch our children rise, she smiled. And it was a sad smile that carried the weight of 10,000 years of struggle. We want to stand on solid ground, she said. That is all we have ever wanted. Threnix stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted in the ancient being's eyes. Then let us see, she said finally. If the galaxy has room for a species that refuses to stay buried. She raised her staff again. The council will vote. Ambassador Yun Sioa had been waiting in the embassy quarters for 6 hours. When she finally decided that patience had its limits, something is wrong, she said to her aide. Lieutenant Park Jinho, who sat across from her at the small table they had been using to review their diplomatic materials. The ceremony was supposed to take 20 minutes. Jinho agreed, and he set down the tablet he had been reading. No other species has ever been delayed this long. Yun stood and walked to the window that looked out over the station's central hub. And she watched ships from dozens of species coming and going. And she wondered if any of them knew what was happening in the council chamber. I reviewed the records of every naming ceremony for the past 500 years, she said. The longest delay was 3 minutes, and that was because the Edamon needed clarification on a species that had 2 names for their world. Jinho joined her at the window. What could Earth's name possibly translate to that would cause this much concern? He asked. Yun had been asking herself the same question, and she did not have an answer. Earth just means ground, she said. Soil, dirt, the stuff we stand on. And I cannot imagine how that could be threatening. A chime sounded at the door, and both humans turned to see a junior diplomat from the Desavane delegation standing in the entrance. Ambassador Yun, the young alien said, and her voice was trembling. I should not be here, but I thought you deserved to know what is happening. Yun gestured for her to enter. What is your name? She asked. Kira the Savane, the diplomat replied, and she glanced nervously over her shoulder before stepping inside. I serve Elder Counselor Myra the Savane, and she sent me with a warning. Jinho closed the door behind her, while Yun guided Kira to a seat. What kind of warning? Yun asked. Kira's large eyes were wide with something that looked like fear. The council has convened an emergency session, she said. Word has spread about the delay in your ceremony, and representatives from across the galaxy are demanding to know why humanity's true name was suppressed. Yun felt her stomach clench. Suppressed? She repeated. Why would they suppress it? Kira shook her head. I do not know the full translation, she admitted. But I overheard Elder the Savane speaking with Counselor Thrinix, and they mentioned the sealed registry. Jinho inhaled sharply. I've heard of that, he said, and his voice had gone quiet. It's supposed to be a myth, a list of species that were deemed too dangerous to exist. It is not a myth, Kira said. My grandmother told me stories about species that were removed from history because their true names revealed them to be threats, and she made me promise never to speak of it. Yun placed her hand on Kira's shoulder. Why are you telling us this? She asked gently. Because Elder the Savane believes you deserve a chance to defend yourselves, Kira replied. She said that the council is afraid, and afraid beings make terrible decisions, and she wanted you to be prepared. Yun exchanged a look with Jinho, and she saw her own confusion reflected in his eyes. We are not a threat, Yun said firmly. Humanity has never attacked another species, and we came here seeking peaceful relations. Kira stood and moved toward the door. I believe you, she said. But the council does not judge species by their actions alone, and the Edamon's translation reveals the truth that lies beneath the surface, and whatever that truth is for humanity. It has terrified beings who have lived for centuries. She paused at the threshold. The emergency session begins in 1 hour. She added, if you want to speak for your people, I suggest you find a way into that chamber. And then she was gone, and Yun was left standing in the embassy quarters with the weight of humanity's future pressing down on her shoulders. We need to get into that session, Jinho said immediately. They will have guards, Yun replied. And we were explicitly told to wait here. Jinho crossed his arms. Since when has humanity ever done what it was told when our survival was at stake? Yun almost smiled at that, but the gravity of the situation kept the expression from reaching her face. She thought about Earth, about the billions of people who were counting on her to establish peaceful relations with the galactic community. And she thought about her grandmother who had survived a war and crossed an ocean and built a new life from nothing. Her grandmother had never waited for permission to survive. Find me the layout of this station, Yun ordered. There has to be a way to access the council chamber without going through the main entrance. Jinho was already pulling up schematics on his tablet. "The maintenance corridors," he said after a moment. "They run beneath the chamber floor, and there are access hatches that the cleaning crews use." Yun studied the map and nodded. "Then that is how we get in," she said. "If the council wants to judge humanity based on the meaning of our world's name, then they are going to hear from a human what that name actually means." She straightened her uniform and checked her reflection in the window. She looked like a diplomat, professional and composed, but inside she felt the fire that had driven her ancestors across frozen continents and burning deserts and endless oceans. Earth's children had never been good. Staying where they were put. "Let's go," she said. The maintenance corridors were cramped and dark, and Yun had to crouch as she made her way through passages that were clearly designed for smaller beings. Jinho followed close behind, and neither of them spoke as they navigated the maze beneath the council chamber. They could hear voices above them, hundreds of voices all speaking at once. And even through the floor, Yun could detect the tone of fear and anger in those sounds. She found the access hatch that Jinho had identified and pressed her hand against it. "This is it," she whispered. "Once I go through, there's no going back. Are you sure about this?" Jinho asked. "If they view this as an intrusion, it could make things worse." Yun considered his words, and she thought about the species in the sealed registry. The ones who had been quarantined or eliminated because the council feared what their names revealed. "My grandmother used to tell me that fear is just a door," she said. "You can let it stop you, or you can walk through it and see what is on the other side." She pushed the hatch open and climbed into the light. The council chamber fell silent as Ambassador Yun Seoha emerged from the floor and stood before hundreds of beings who looked at her with expressions ranging from shock to terror. Elder Councilor Thrinix rose from her throne, and her voice rang out across the chamber. "Ambassador, you were instructed to remain in your quarters." You met the ancient being's eyes without flinching, with respect. "Elder Counselor," she said, "when someone is deciding the fate of your people, you do not wait to be invited to speak." She looked around the chamber at all the faces turned toward her, and she saw fear in most of them. And she understood that fear was what she needed to address. "I invoke the right of the accused," Yun declared, "as established in the founding charter of this council, which states that no species may be condemned without the opportunity to speak in their own defense." Thrinix stared at her for a long moment, and something that might have been respect flickered in her ancient eyes. "The right is granted," she said finally. "Humanity may speak." Yun stepped forward into the center of the chamber, alone before the galaxy, and she prepared to fight for her world with the only weapon she had, the truth about what it meant to be human. The Forbidden's archive existed beneath the council chamber in a place that most beings did not know about, and Councilor Vaughn Kethry had only heard rumors of it during his 2 centuries of life. Now he walked through its entrance alongside Elder Thrinix, and the weight of 10,000 years of secrets pressed down on him like water. "I did not know this place was real," he admitted, and his voice echoed strangely off walls that seemed to absorb sound. "Few do," Thrinix replied, and she moved with the certainty of someone who had walked this path many times before. "The archive contains records that the council decided were too dangerous for public knowledge, and some truths are better left buried." Vaughn felt a chill at her choice of words, and he could not stop thinking about Earth's true name and what it meant about burial and rising. The corridor opened into a vast chamber filled with crystalline storage units that rose from floor to ceiling, and each one contained the complete records of species that had been removed from official history, the sealed registry, Thrinix announced, and she spread her arms to encompass the thousands of glowing crystals. Every species whose true name revealed them to be an existential threat to galactic civilization. Vaughn walked among the crystals, And he read the names displayed on their surfaces. The HFY, he said, stopping before one unit. I have never heard of them. Their world's true name translated to the hunting ground, Threnix explained. And she came to stand beside him. They viewed all existence as prey, and they could not conceive of other beings as anything but targets. What happened to them? Quarantine, Threnix said, and her voice held no emotion. Their system was sealed before they achieved faster-than-light travel, and they remain there to this day, hunting each other because we gave them nothing else to hunt. Vorn moved to another crystal, the Mordax. He read, their world was called the Crucible of Dominion, and their entire psychology was built around conquest and subjugation. And the Council determined that they could never coexist peacefully with other species. Vorn did not ask what happened to the Mordax, and the absence of their crystal's glow told him everything he needed to know. You eliminated them, he said. And it was not a question. We prevented a war that would have consumed half the galaxy. Threnix replied, and she finally met his eyes. The Council does not make such decisions lightly, but we have made them, and we will make them again if necessary. Vorn felt sick, and he turned away from the dark crystal. Is that why we are here? He asked. Are you suggesting that humanity should be added to the sealed registry? Threnix walked to a console at the center of the chamber and began entering commands. I'm suggesting that we need more information before we decide anything, she said. The Edamon's translation was unprecedented in its complexity, and I need to understand what we are dealing with. The console projected a holographic display, and data began flowing across it in streams of light. I have pulled everything our scouts gathered during the initial contact period. Threnix continued. Let us see what kind of species names their world after burial grounds. The display showed a blue and green planet spinning slowly in the void, and Vorn thought it looked peaceful from this distant Earth, Threnix said, and she began reading the data. Third planet from their star, and it has a single large moon, and approximately 70% of the surface is covered in water. It sounds pleasant. Vorn offered. It is not, Threnix replied, and her voice had gone flat. Earth has an axial tilt of approximately 23 degrees, which creates seasonal variations extreme enough to kill unprotected beings. And humans evolve through cycles of freezing and burning that repeat every year. Vorn blinked all four of his eyes. Every year? He repeated. Their climate tries to kill them every year. It gets worse, Threnix said, and she pulled up more data. The planet has active plate tectonics, which means the ground itself moves and shifts and breaks apart. And humans have experienced earthquakes that destroyed entire cities within seconds. Vorn sat down on the nearest surface, and his legs no longer felt strong enough to hold him. They built cities on ground that could destroy them at any moment? He asked. They built cities on ground that had already destroyed them, Threnix corrected. Multiple times. And they simply rebuilt in the same locations. The display shifted to show a timeline of Earth's history, and Vorn watched in growing horror as it cataloged the catastrophes humanity had survived. Ice ages that covered half the planet in frozen death, and volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun for years, and asteroid impacts that killed nearly everything alive, and plagues that reduced their population by half, and floods and droughts and famines and wars. How are they still alive? Vorn whispered. That is the question that should terrify you, Threnix replied. And she zoomed in on a specific entry in the timeline. Look at this. Approximately 66 million years before humans evolved, an asteroid struck Earth and killed nearly all life on the planet. And yet life returned. Vorn said, life returned. Threnix confirmed. And eventually, humans emerged from the survivors, and they evolved on a world that had already proven it could end everything at any moment. She turned to face Vorn directly. "Do you understand what that means?" she asked. These beings did not evolve on a world of comfort and safety like most species. And they did not develop on a planet that nurtured them. And they came from a world that actively tried to kill them from the moment they came into existence, Vorn understood. And the understanding made him want to flee the archive and never return. They named their world Earth, because Earth is what remains after everything else is destroyed. He said slowly, "The soil that covers the dead and feeds the living, and the ground that buries one generation and gives rise to the next." "Yes," Threnix said, and she pulled up one final piece of data. "And their mythology confirms it." The display showed excerpts from human stories spanning thousands of years. And Vorn read them with growing dread, gods who died and came back to life, and heroes who descended into the underworld and returned, and entire civilizations that fell and rose from their own ashes. And the concept of resurrection appeared in every human culture across every continent and every era. "They do not fear extinction," Threnix concluded, and her voice was barely audible. "They expect it. And they have built their entire psychological framework around the assumption that death is temporary." Vorn stood on unsteady legs and looked at his fellow elder counselor. "What do we do?" he asked. Threnix was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "We summon the full council," she said, "and we pray to whatever gods might listen that humanity's definition of rising does not require the burial of everyone else first." She turned off the display, and the archive fell into darkness around them. And Vorn Ketheri followed her back toward the light with the certain knowledge that the galaxy had changed forever. The Galactic Council chamber stretched upward like the inside of a great shell, its curved walls holding thousands of seats filled with beings from across known space. And at its center stood a single platform where new species came to receive their names. Ambassador Yun. Sioha had prepared for this moment her entire career. And now she stood on that platform wearing the formal black uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, her hands clasped behind her back as she faced the 7 elder counselors who sat on their elevated thrones. The ceremony was supposed to be simple, and every species that achieved faster than light travel went through it. And it had been happening for 10,000 years, without incident. "We welcome the representatives of the newly contacted world," Elder Counselor Threnix announced, her voice carrying through the chamber without amplification. And her pale blue skin seemed to glow under the ceremonial lights. Yun bowed slightly, remembering her training. And she kept her expression calm even though her heart was beating hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "The Edamon will now process your world's designation," Threnix continued. And she gestured toward a pillar of light that rose from the floor beside the platform. The Edamon was not alive in any way, Yun understood. But it was ancient beyond measure, and it had analyzed the names of 10,000 worlds to find their true names. And every species in the galaxy had gone through this exact process. Yun had studied the records, and she knew what to expect. And she had seen the beautiful names other species had received. The Drethkai had been named Children of the Warm Currents, because their world's name translated to concepts of flowing heat and comfort. And the Vorathans had been called Singers to Stone, because they named their planet after the mountains they loved. And the Vezavane were known as those who tend the eternal garden, because their world meant paradise in their ancient tongue. These names were sources of pride, and species displayed them on their ships and their flags and their buildings. And it was considered a great honor to have a beautiful true name the Pillar of Light pulsed. And a voice that seemed to come from everywhere spoke in perfect English. "Speak your world's primary designation." Yun cleared her throat. "Earth," she said. And her voice was steady despite her nerves. The Edamon processed, and Yun waited. and she expected it to take only a few seconds like it did for other species. But the seconds stretched on, and the chamber grew quiet. And Yun noticed that some of the council members were looking at each other with confusion. 5 seconds passed, and then 10, and the Edamon had never taken this long before Elder Threnix leaned forward in her throne. And her ancient face showed something Yun could not read 11 seconds after Yun had spoken. The Edamon's light flickered in a way that looked almost like uncertainty. "Translation complete," the Edamon announced. But then it added something that made the chamber gasp. "I request a closed session with the Elder Council only, and the translation will not be announced publicly at this time." Yun felt confusion wash over her, and she looked up at Threnix. "Is something wrong?" She asked. Threnix's expression had become carefully neutral, and she rose from her throne with a grace that belied her 6 centuries of life. "Ambassador Yun, we thank you for your patience, and there appears to be a procedural matter we must address. And we ask that you wait in the embassy quarters while we resolve it." 2 guards in ceremonial armor appeared at Yun's side, and they were polite but firm as they gestured toward the exit. "I don't understand," Yun said, and she felt the first cold touch of worry in her stomach. "Has this happened before?" "Please," Threnix said, and there was something in her voice that Yun could not identify. "We will send for you when we are ready," Yun wanted to argue. But she knew that pushing too hard could damage the diplomatic relationship before it even began. And so she bowed again and allowed the guards to escort her from the chamber. As she walked, she looked back over her shoulder and saw the elder counselors descending from their thrones. And their movements were quick in a way that suggested urgency. The massive doors closed behind her with a sound like thunder, and Yun was left standing in the corridor with questions she could not answer inside the sealed chamber. The 7 elder counselors gathered around a smaller platform, where the Edamon's interface displayed text that only they could see. Counselor Vorn Cathary, the youngest of the elders, at only 200 years old, pushed forward. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, and his 4 eyes blinked rapidly with agitation. "The Edamon has never refused a public announcement." Elder Threnix raised one long-fingered hand for silence, and she stared at the display with an expression that Vorn had never seen on her face before. "Read it," Councilor Myra the Sylvain urged, and her voice trembled slightly. Threnix read the translation aloud, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "Primary surface translation. Ground. Soil, dirt." Vorn made a dismissive sound. "That is hardly frightening," he said. "They named their world after dirt, and that suggests a humble species. Perhaps even a primitive one." "There is more," Threnix said, and she scrolled down the display. "The Edamon found deeper layers. And this has only happened twice before in recorded history." The other counselors grew very still, and Vorn felt his certainty begin to crumble. The humans did not name their world after soil in the sense of growth or fertility. Threnix continued. The Edamon analyzed their linguistic roots across hundreds of languages and thousands of years of development, and it found a consistent pattern. She looked up at her fellow counselors, and Vorn saw something in her eyes that he had never expected to see. "Fear, Earth's true name, translates to that which remains when all else has fallen." She read, and her voice cracked on the final words. "The final ground. The place where things are buried and from which things rise again." The chamber was silent. Counselor the Sylvain sat down heavily, and her breathing had become shallow. "They named their world after graves," she whispered. "After burial, after death, after endings. But also after rising," Vorn said. And he was trying to understand. What does that mean? Elder Threnix picked up her ceremonial staff, and her grip on it was tight enough that her knuckles had gone white. "It means that this species has embedded the concept of death and resurrection into the very name of their home," she said. It means that somewhere in their evolution, they experienced something so terrible that survival itself became their defining characteristic. And they encoded that truth into the most fundamental word in their language. She looked at each of her fellow counselors in turn. It means we have just made first contact with a species that does not merely endure hardship, she said. They have built their entire identity around the expectation of catastrophe and the determination to survive it anyway. Her ceremonial staff slipped from her fingers and clattered against the floor. And the sound echoed through the silent chamber like a warning bell. "Summon the archive keepers," Threnix ordered. And her voice had gone cold with purpose. "We need to know if we have seen this before. And we need to know what happened to the last species with a name like this." Vorn Cathary stared at the translation still glowing on the display. And he wondered what kind of world could produce beings who named their home after the ground that swallowed the dead and gave birth to the living. He wondered if the galaxy was ready to find out.